Text message came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a truck stop outside of Amarillo eating eggs that had no business being called eggs. It was from my next-door neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Connie who had lived on our street for going on 30 years. We weren't close. She watered her roses, I waved from the driveway. That was the extent of it. So when her name showed up on my phone screen before 7 in the morning, my stomach did something I didn't expect. "Walter, I don't want to be nosy, but there have been cars in your driveway almost every weekend for the past 2 months. Different cars each time. Last Saturday there were 6 of them. I almost called the non-emergency line but wanted to check with you first. Hope everything is all right." I stared at that message for a long time. I set my fork down. I'm a long-haul freight auditor. I work for a regional logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio, and my job is to physically visit distribution hubs, warehouses, and freight yards across a 7-state territory and verify that what's on paper matches what's actually sitting on a loading dock. It's not glamorous. It's also not the kind of job you can do from a laptop at your kitchen table. Most weeks I'm gone Sunday night through Friday afternoon. Some weeks I don't come home at all. There have been stretches where my own house felt like a hotel I visited once a month. A place where I kept clothes and a good mattress and not much else. My wife and I divorced 4 years ago. Our kids are grown and live out of state. The house, a 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb of Columbus, was mine outright after the settlement. I kept it because selling felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. So I kept it, and I kept paying the mortgage, and I kept going back to it on weekends to mow the lawn and restock the fridge and sleep in my own bed. 6 cars in my driveway last Saturday. I hadn't been home last Saturday. I'd been in Des Moines doing a compliance audit at a refrigerated storage facility. I wrote back to Connie and asked her to describe the cars. "Sedans," she said. "Clean ones. Nice ones, actually," she added. "And people going in and out in small groups. Always well dressed. Never loud." She'd assumed at first that I'd started having people over, but then it kept happening every single weekend without me ever being around, and she thought she should say something. I thanked her. I sat there in that truck stop with cold eggs in front of me, and I tried to think of a single explanation that made sense. I couldn't. I drove the 7 hours back to Columbus that afternoon instead of waiting until Friday. The house looked completely normal when I pulled onto the cul-de-sac. Lawn was fine. Porch light was off. My neighbor Connie was pruning something in her side yard, and she gave me a long look as I turned into my own driveway. I raised a hand. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're glad you finally showed up. Inside, everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. More or less. I walked through every room, slowly, the way you do when you're looking for something you can't name. Living room, dining room, kitchen, the 2 spare bedrooms. Nothing missing, nothing broken. But there were small things. A ring on the kitchen counter where a glass had sat, slightly to the left of where I ever put things. A crease in the bedspread in the front guest room, the one I never used. A faint smell in the hallway. Not bad, just different. Something clean, like air freshener or fabric softener, and I don't use fabric softener. I stood in the hallway for a minute just breathing. Then I checked the spare key. I kept a spare key in a magnetic holder under the lip of the deck railing in the backyard. It was a habit from years of travel. If I ever locked myself out, if a contractor needed access, that key was there. I'd had it there for 6 years and never thought twice about it. It was gone. Not moved, not dropped. Gone. I went and sat down at my kitchen table and tried to think clearly. Someone had my spare key. Someone had been using my house on weekends while I was gone. Multiple cars, multiple people, every single Saturday for at least 2 months. Well dressed, quiet, coming and going in groups. I thought about who had ever known about that key. The list was short. My ex-wife, who had moved to Phoenix and had zero reason to organize weekend gatherings at a house in Ohio she no longer owned. My daughter, who lived in Portland. a plumber I'd called the previous spring, and one other person, a man I'd hired about 8 months earlier to help with some repairs and light maintenance when I kept missing weekends I'd planned to be home. He came with a recommendation from someone at my office, seemed reliable, knew how to handle himself around a house. His name was Philip. I'd shown him the key location myself. I hadn't heard from Philip in about 3 months. I'd assumed he'd found steadier work and moved on. I wasn't sure anymore. The first thing I did was call the Columbus Police non-emergency line and explain what I knew. Neighbor reported repeated activity at my house during my absences, spare key missing, signs of use inside. The officer I spoke with was polite. He was also very clear. If nothing's been stolen and there's no sign of forced entry, it's a difficult situation to act on. Do you have any evidence that someone's been entering without permission? Any records, any camera footage? I didn't have cameras. I'd always meant to put cameras up and never gotten around to it. I told him that. I'd strongly recommend installing cameras as soon as possible. If you catch someone entering on footage, that changes things significantly. But right now, without evidence of a crime in progress, there's not a lot we can do. I thanked him and hung up. I understood his position. I didn't like it, but I understood it. That night I drove to a home improvement store and bought 4 security cameras, 2 for the exterior, 1 covering the front door, 1 covering the back. I installed them myself that evening, connected them to my phone, tested every angle. Then I changed the locks on every exterior door. Every single one. I bought a keypad deadbolt for the front and a new key deadbolt for the back and threw away every existing key. It took me 4 hours and cost me about $300. Then I did something I probably should have done when Connie's text first came in. I sat down with 6 weeks of bank and utility statements. My electric bill had averaged about $68 a month for the past 2 years. The previous 3 months it had come in at $112, $119, and $106. My water bill told the same story. Someone wasn't just walking through my house. Someone was using it. Lighting it, running water in it, doing whatever you do when you have a group of people in a house on a Saturday. I made a note of the amounts and the dates. Then I set an alert on my phone for the cameras and drove back to Columbus before midnight. I had to be in Cincinnati by 8 the next morning. I won't pretend the following 3 weeks were easy. Every time my camera alert went off, I nearly dropped whatever I was holding. Most of the time it was just a delivery truck or a squirrel crossing the backyard. But the second Saturday after I'd changed the locks and installed the cameras, at 10:14 in the morning, a silver Lexus pulled up in front of my house. I was at a warehouse in Dayton. I watched the whole thing on my phone. A man got out of the Lexus, 40s, dressed well, khakis, a button down like he was going to a casual work event. He walked up my front path with complete confidence, the way someone walks to a door they've walked to 100 times. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. He put the key in the deadbolt. It didn't turn. He tried it again and again. Then he stepped back and looked at the door, and I watched on my camera feed as something passed across his face. I couldn't make out his expression clearly, but his posture changed. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked back to his car and made a phone call. I screenshotted everything. 2 minutes later, a second car arrived. A woman got out, also well dressed. They stood on the sidewalk in front of my house and had what looked like a short, tense conversation. Then they both left. I called Columbus PD again with the footage. The officer I reached this time was more engaged. I had clear video, timestamps, a man attempting entry with a key that no longer worked. That was enough to open a case number and send someone to take a look when I got back to town. I drove back to Columbus that Saturday afternoon. I met with a detective, a patient, thorough woman, who listened without interrupting. At my house that evening, I showed her the camera footage, the utility bills, the missing key, the timeline. I told her about Philip. She asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Do you know what your house looks like on Airbnb?" I didn't understand at first. She explained. She had seen this before, she said. Not often, but more than once. Someone with access to a property or knowledge of a property lists it on a short-term rental platform using photos of the actual house, takes bookings while the legitimate owner is away, collects the money, lets guests in, and pockets everything. The guests think they booked a legal rental. The owner has no idea. I asked her how someone could manage that without getting caught. She said the key, the literal physical key, was usually the starting point. If you have a key, you can let people in, and if you know the owner's schedule, you know exactly when it's safe to do it. I thought about my schedule. I thought about how many times I'd casually mentioned to Philip, while showing him something around the house, that I'd be gone most of next month, or that I was heading out Sunday and wouldn't be back until the following Friday. My schedule wasn't a secret. I worked for a company. I had a company vehicle. Anyone who knew me professionally could probably piece together roughly when I was and wasn't in Columbus. Or they could just watch my driveway long enough to figure it out. The detective asked if I still had Philip's contact information. I did. I gave her everything I had. What came out over the following 2 weeks was something I'm still processing. Philip had been listing my house on 2 different platforms, one of the major ones and a smaller one I hadn't heard of, under a fake host profile. He'd taken photographs of the interior at some point before I'd changed the locks, probably during a legitimate visit. He'd been collecting bookings on weekends since approximately 4 months after I'd first hired him, at a rate that put the average weekend somewhere between $300 and $400. The detective estimated that he'd taken in somewhere in the range of $18,000 to $20,000 over those months. My house, my electricity, my water, my address, his pocket. The guests, for what it's worth, had mostly left positive reviews. I found the listings myself once the detective pointed me toward the fake profile name. 5 stars from a family who said the house was cozy and well located. 4.5 from someone who appreciated the quiet neighborhood and the easy check-in process. Easy check-in, sure, I'd made it very easy. I put a key under my deck railing and never thought about it for 6 years. When the detective contacted Philip, he initially denied everything. Then the platform records came in. The account had been created with an email address that contained a variation of his last name, which was either bold or stupid, possibly both. The payouts had gone to a bank account in his name. There was no meaningful defense. He retained a lawyer, and approximately 5 weeks after Connie sent me that text message in the truck stop in Amarillo, Philip was charged with theft by deception, criminal trespassing, and fraud. His lawyer tried to argue that the guests had been legitimately renting a property he had implied he managed. It didn't go far. I want to tell you about the money, because people always want to know about the money. The platforms cooperated once law enforcement got involved. The payout records were clear. Restitution was ordered as part of the resolution, $18,400, to be paid back to me over time. Whether I'll ever see all of it, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that both platforms issued statements to the detectives department, and at least one of them reached out to me directly to explain their process for flagging fraudulent listings, which I found more depressing than reassuring, because the listing had been up for months, multiple bookings, dozens of check-ins, and no one flagged anything until a detective sent them a formal request. I also want to tell you about the IRS piece because I looked into it after someone I mentioned this to brought it up. The income Philip collected, roughly $18,000 to $20,000, was unreported. That's a federal tax matter, not my department to pursue, but I made sure to mention it in my statement, and I understand the relevant agencies were made aware. What came of that is not something I was ever given details about, but I made sure it was part of the record. Here's the part I keep coming back to. The man I'd hired to help with my house, the man I trusted enough to show my spare key to, the man I chatted with on a Saturday morning about how long I'd be on the road. He hadn't broken into my house. He hadn't smashed a window or kicked a door or done any of the things we picture when we think about someone violating our space. He'd been given a key, more or less, through my own carelessness. And he'd used it to turn my home into a business while I was out in the country checking inventory numbers at loading docks. The guests had no idea anything was wrong. From their perspective, they booked a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, and it had been exactly what the photos showed. Some of them were probably lovely people. It didn't matter. They were sitting on my furniture and sleeping in my guest room and using my shower without my knowledge and without my consent. And the money they paid went to someone who had no right to it. What bothers me most, thinking back on it, is how long it went on. I've done the math. If it started roughly 4 months after I first hired Philip, and Connie texted me after she'd been watching it for at least 2 months, and then it took me another 3 weeks to collect enough evidence, we're talking somewhere around 7 months. 7 months of weekend rentals, guests parking in my driveway, walking through my front door, leaving reviews, and I had no idea. My utility bills went up. I noticed they were higher and told myself energy costs were rising, which they were, but not that much. My spare key was missing, and I'd never noticed because I never reached for it. Why would I? I was almost never locked out. The guest room bedspread had a crease in it from where someone had slept, and I'd smoothed it out once when I got home one weekend without really thinking about it. I had been the easiest possible mark, and I had made myself that way through years of assuming that absence was the same as security. I sold the house. I want to be honest about that. I went back and forth on it for a long time. The detective told me I didn't have to, that with new locks and cameras and a proper renter monitoring system it would be fine. My daughter, when I called her, said the same thing. "Don't let him win," she said. But I walked through every room of that house one more time about 2 months after everything was resolved, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand in the guest room without thinking about 5-star reviews from strangers who'd slept there. I couldn't walk past the deck railing without seeing the empty spot where that magnetic key holder had sat for 6 years. I found a townhouse about 15 minutes from my office. Smaller, no yard to worry about, a doorman-staffed entry with a fob system and cameras on every floor. It's not the house I'd imagine keeping, but I sleep fine in it. Connie got a handwritten note from me and a gift card to a garden centre she likes. It wasn't enough, but I didn't know what else to say to someone who had done me a favour just by paying attention. If she hadn't sent that text, if she'd decided it wasn't her business, if she'd figured I'd started having weekend guests and left it alone, I don't know how much longer it would have gone on. Another month, another season, another year. Philip would have kept booking weekends into my house until something else gave him away, or until it didn't. There's no tidy lesson in this that I haven't already heard. Lock your doors, know your contractors, put up cameras. Don't leave a key under your deck railing and tell yourself nobody will ever find it. I knew all of that before this happened. The way you know you should floss every day and save 15% of your income. You know it. You just don't always do it. What I'll say instead is this. If you're someone who travels for work, who spends most of your week somewhere that isn't your home, who is handed a key or a code or a level of trust to someone who came recommended and seemed fine, take a look at your utility bills. Take a look at your credit card statements. Ask your neighbors if they've noticed anything. Not because something is wrong, but because you might not know yet if something is. Connie didn't owe me that text message. She sent it anyway. I owe her more than a gift card. I owe her whatever version of this story might make someone else check their spare key before they have to. I keep thinking about the spare key. Not Philip, not the platforms, not the $18,000. The key. A little magnetic holder I screwed under a deck railing 6 years ago, told myself it was practical and never thought about again. That was the beginning of all of it. Not a hack, not a con, not some elaborate scheme I couldn't have seen coming. A key I left out because I assumed that out of sight meant out of danger. There's something uncomfortable about that, and I've had enough months now to sit with the discomfort instead of explaining it away. The honest answer is that I made it easy. I was gone most of every week. I had a house that sat empty and visible, and I handed a stranger enough trust and access to turn my absence into his income. Philip made a choice I'll never excuse. But I created the conditions that made his choice low risk and high reward, and I did it through a kind of laziness I used to call convenience. What I've come to believe is that the way we protect the things we care about is a reflection of how clearly we're thinking, not just about security, about everything. Connie paid attention when I didn't. She noticed a pattern across weeks, held on to the information long enough to decide it mattered, and then did the harder thing, which was to reach out to someone she barely knew and say something that might have made her look foolish if she'd been wrong. That's not luck. That's a habit of mind. She was watching the world around her with enough care and precision to catch something I'd completely missed from inside my own life. I think about that when I catch myself on autopilot now, going through routines, assuming things are fine because they've always been fine, telling myself I'll deal with something later because later has always worked out. Later is how you end up with 7 months of strangers sleeping in your guest room while you're in Cincinnati checking freight manifests. The part that took me longest to reckon with was the recovery, not the legal part, not selling the house, the internal part. Because my first instinct, when everything came out, was to feel stupid. And I spent some real time in that feeling. But stupid isn't what happened. What happened is that I wasn't paying attention, and when something told me to pay attention, a higher utility bill, a crease in a bedspread, a missing key I never reached for, I explained it away instead of following it. That's not stupidity, that's avoidance. And avoidance is a choice you can stop making. I stopped making it. I changed the locks the same night I figured out something was wrong. I drove back from Dayton to watch the footage in real time. I called the detective and sat in that meeting and answered every question completely, even the ones that made me look careless. I didn't minimize it, didn't try to control the narrative, didn't wait for someone else to fix it. You have to be willing to look directly at a situation, including the parts where you contributed to it, and then do the next right thing anyway. That's the only way through. Philip is facing real consequences for what he did. That matters. But what I walk away with, the thing that actually changed how I move through the world, has nothing to do with him. It has to do with me deciding that paying attention is not optional, that honoring the things you've built, a home, a life, a sense of safety, means showing up for them even when you're tired and busy and 6 states away. That the smallest acts of diligence, a neighbor who sends a text, a man who checks his own bills, a woman who keeps watching even when it isn't her job, are what actually hold things together. Connie didn't owe me anything. She gave me everything anyway. I haven't forgotten that.